You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
We interrupt this broadcast for a message from the President of the United States. Now, the President. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the streets.
That is what you would have heard June 11th, 1963, if you flicked your TV on. It was a fantastic speech, considering that John F. Kennedy is a guy that in the 1960 election won without California, who won Georgia by 60% and didn't have a contest in Alabama. He was relying on the same political base as his 19th century Democratic predecessors, winning the solid South. And now he was challenging his very base. Fantastic speech, except for a tragedy that occurred. 3 hours after President Kennedy spoke, a man pulled his car into his driveway, opened his car door, and walked towards his house, and was hit. Medgar Evers died instantly, a victim of the bullet of a sniper. Evers was, along with Aaron Henry, one of a group of black Mississippi World War II veterans who had started, since their return from the war, organizing veterans to vote. By the time of the 1960s, Henry and Evers were well-established civil rights activists and working with groups such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP to register not just veterans, but everyone. Something was occurring in the South between the 1940s and the 1960s. Black registration went from 6% in 1940 in the South to 43% in 1964. This is before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The textbook history is kind of that the federal government passed a law and everything was okay after that. But what you see here is that activists were also in the South registering people to vote, and it started with those veterans returning from the war. But Mississippi, with a rural sharecropper population and extreme segregation in its laws and government, had a far lower rate than other states even in the South. Mississippi became a target. By the middle of 1964, Freedom Summer was a massive operation demonstrating the Northern support, dollars, volunteers might help to overcome and empower black Mississippians. Current law required that in order to vote, literacy tests could be applied. Now, how does this work? Well, if it was a white voter going to the registrar, they just might ask, what is the slogan of Mississippi, or what's the state flower, or something like this. If it's a black voter coming to register, the registrar could ask one of 283 different questions about parts of the Mississippi Constitution. Fail one, and you don't get to vote. So the idea of the Freedom Summer was to bring a lot of volunteers down to help register people and to make them prepare for the test so that they would be aware of the Mississippi State Constitution, as hard as that was to memorize. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would end up registering 17,000 blacks, or at least getting them to fill out the form. Only a small percentage, about 10%, would be able to vote in Mississippi. Now, if they couldn't get them to go down to the courthouse, which was a difficult thing, and we'll explain why, they would have the person sign a ballot, a freedom ballot. to join the Freedom Democratic Party and indicate their support. Some 80,000 joined. This would allow them to eventually go to the Atlantic City Convention. The Democrats were holding their national convention, and under the hot TV lights, make the public case to challenge the official segregated Democratic Party, which had cut them out. But they also tried something bolder. Since Mississippi had underfunded its public schools, expelled students who participated in civil rights, and didn't teach black history, didn't teach any history from 1860 to 1875, just caused too much trouble to talk about the Reconstruction in Mississippi. The idea is that with dollars from Northern donors, they would do something incredible. They would create an alternative education system in the state. Freedom schools that would meet on porches, that would meet under trees, that would meet in churches, wherever they could meet, and where volunteers would teach children and sometimes adults as well. In half the counties in Mississippi, these freedom schools developed, and it was a way for people to participate, even if they had limited political involvement and limited education. The Freedom Summer volunteers who taught at these schools and helped register people, 1,000 of them, were mostly white, from some of the top Ivy League schools in the country where they had been activists in their schools. A heroic volunteerism. They were told little more than to keep away from windows, pull the shades down, don't tell people where you're staying. Don't let anyone pass you on a road if you're alone. And check your car for bombs before you start it. There was a harsh reaction. The white citizens' councils in Mississippi reacted, bombing churches and homes, about 70 bombings all told in 1964 alone, attacking teachers from the school, attacking the volunteers, attacking students on their way to the schools. The Mississippi legislature banned teaching or gathering, as well as banning passing leaflets or boycotts. They stockpiled weapons, they stockpiled tear gas, they doubled the size of the Mississippi State Trooper Force. The Freedom Democratic Party visited Washington in June to try to get help or protection from the federal government. President, it was said, was not in, and Robert F. Kennedy, Attorney General, despite his posthumous record on civil rights in this case, was not much help. 3 Freedom Summer volunteers, Michael Schwirmer, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, were arrested by the sheriff in Philadelphia, Mississippi. At midnight, they were released and promptly disappeared. Now, Goodman and Schwirmer were white. Therefore, it made news that they had disappeared. Lyndon Johnson tried to get Mississippi officials to help, tried to get Senator James Eastland to help. But in the state, the story was, oh, these civil rights activists, they're just playing a fast one on us. They're probably in a bar in Chicago laughing at us. This is just a publicity stunt. The FBI refused to help until Attorney General Robert Kennedy then ordered them to. Now, Hoover follows his orders, sets up an office in Mississippi to get 200 sailors from a local naval base, and together with lots of agents and sailors, they search the swamps of Mississippi. In August of '64, the bodies of Chaney, Schwirmer, and Goodman are found under a dam. The nation was outraged by the killings. But this federal search resulted in more than just 3 bodies. And that's something that wasn't reported a lot at the time and doesn't get a lot of reportage now in the history of the story. There were 8 other victims. Charles Eddie Moore, Henry D., had protested at their local college and were expelled. Now they got a death sentence. Herbert Orsby, a 14-year-old, was found. His crime, wearing a Congress of Racial Equality T-shirt. 5 more black males, never identified, found during that search. Textbook history misses the pain and the hurt sometimes of political change. The reality is, with little or no help from the federal government, a war went on in Mississippi in 1964, and many people gave their lives to have constitutional rights. And we can also say this: it wasn't all that long ago. Many of the people who participated in Freedom Summer are still alive. Many people with memories of the events are still alive. And I bring up the civil rights movement to address the question of what is needed to make political change. What kind of sacrifices? What kind of numbers? What kind of numbers do you actually need to make any kind of policy change? It's a question about the American Revolution. Is it true that only a small percentage of people supported that revolution, and yet it happened? So those are things I'll look at today. And what level of participation did civil rights get? More broadly, what's the percentage of people you need to actually make the change? Is it 5%, 10%? Do you actually need 100% of your group? So in Mississippi, you're talking about a fairly radical, described in northern papers as leftist, Freedom Democratic Party, the FDP. Initially, a few thousand black citizens with volunteers from across the country. This is compared to a 2.1 million population in Mississippi at the time, about 40% of that black, or 800,000. Now, that's level one, the deep supporters, the big volunteers. Then you had about, as I mentioned before, 17,000 people who, according to the descriptions of civil rights veterans, were people who tried to register, agreed to go to the courthouse. Now, they say try to register because usually they were not able to do so. There was a risk. The absolute best is that they'd get to vote. Second best is that they'd be denied the right to vote and everything would end there. They could also be attacked on the way to the courthouse after they come back. In Macomb County, Mississippi, their name would be printed in the newspaper so people knew what to do. They'd be ostracized, no one would do business with them, and their employers would fire them. But then you had about 10% of the total black population in Mississippi, about 80,000 people, who agreed to join the Freedom Democratic Party. Now, this did not mean that they could vote just because they filled out a freedom ballot, but it did mean that the FDB could go and in their name go to Atlantic City and say that they represented the true Democratic Party of Mississippi because it was the one party that wasn't kicking anyone out. It gave them numbers, it intimidated politicians, and it tempted politicians who might be thinking about supporting civil rights. So at high levels of intensity of involvement, 1% maybe of the population. At lower levels, 10%, and you have some policy change. But it's slow change. Even after the 1965 Voting Rights Act in Mississippi, there was intimidation and difficulty. Really, it wasn't until the late 70s, the 1980s, when you start seeing black officials elected in Mississippi.
August's a great time to hit the reset button before you're hitting that maddening rush of fall. I can't think of a better place to clear my closet than Quince. I love shopping there. Now, I've shopped from Quince. I have a great black, long sleeve, thick cotton shirt. Looks great. Quince specializes in everyday staples that work harder, like their ultra-soft organic cotton tees or premium Mongolian cashmere sweaters. You buy something like that somewhere else, you're going to regret it every time you put it on because it cost you so much. Not with Quince. Upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/myhist. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK too. That's QUINCE.com/MYHIST.
Let's look at another effort at civil rights, the Montgomery Bus Boycott of 55 and 56. Textbook version. Rosa Parks doesn't give up her seat in the front of the bus, but she's supposed to because she is black, and the front of the bus is for whites only. She's arrested, and a bus boycott starts spontaneously. Well, that did happen. There's more to the story. Parks, the seamstress, was also the secretary of the local NAACP. She was assigned the role of not leaving her seat, and the boycott was not spontaneous, but very much planned. In 1955, a group of black citizens called the Montgomery Improvement Association, led by a new minister named Martin Luther King Jr., boycotted the bus lines until they allowed black passengers to sit wherever they wanted on the bus. Now, in this case, in Montgomery, you have about 40,000 black citizens, and about 85 to 90% of them were participating in this boycott. The boycott idea was brilliant because there was no action. You didn't occupy a road. You didn't occupy a government building. You didn't even go to a courthouse and register to vote. You simply took a passive action, or really a non-action. You didn't take the bus. And therefore, it didn't give a bus company who was segregating your money if you were a black citizen. At first, this was opposed by an entire white community. As the months passed, it started to hurt the bus line. 70% of the Montgomery bus line's customers were black, and now those customers were gone. They canceled holiday service in 55. They raised fares in 56. It didn't matter. Their bus line was dying. So by April of 56, now you have the bus company cracking. And the president says, well, I wish the law was changed where people could sit wherever they want on the bus. Then the bus company told drivers, don't enforce the law. Now the white community was divided. Business leaders in Montgomery hated the stigma that was on their city now because of the boycott, and the bus company needed the revenue. It got so bad that the city sued the bus line for not enforcing the segregation law. The city attacked the Montgomery Improvement Association, Martin Luther King's group. They brought King to court on boycott conspiracy charges, and they sued them over the alternative transportation system that they had set up. The brilliance of the Montgomery boycott was that they had volunteers who donated cars, and they had black citizens who had cars who were willing to ride people around, and they created a very effective system that ran like clockwork, 90 pickup spots across the city, so everyone could get where they were going without using the bus. The city sued, and in state court, were just on the verge of eliminating that alternative transport system, which would have caused problem for the boycotters, except that Gail v. Bowder at the Supreme Court, November 1956, that segregation on buses must end. Now, it wasn't over. Once the buses were integrated in the city, whites attacked them, they bombed Martin Luther King's house. For a few months after the decision, nobody rode the buses. And when bus service was back to normal, some blacks still rode in the back of the bus just due to social mores. Yet Montgomery's boycott was historic and effective. Many cities across the South were forced to change their policies. What's apparent here is what you might expect. A small, motivated group with a good cause, with supreme organization. And by the way, the civil rights organizations were well run. Precinct captains, leadership, it was like the army. You didn't argue. They had meetings where you could argue, but when you were out there on the field, you listened to your precinct captain. They weren't troubled by the existential questions of what are we doing, like some of the anti-war protests that would follow them. The activists, with persistence, with righteousness of cause, were able to persuade a larger group to take some kind of action, maybe more moderate than what they were doing, and suffer a bit, everyone, in a long time, and change happened. To go towards this question of how much participation you need and how policy change happens, we'll go to a very different example in a very different place. March 1976, President of Argentina, Isabella Perón, was taken prisoner by her own generals. She had had a problem quelling a guerrilla war up in the north of the country and called on her generals to fight it, which they did. But the generals weren't satisfied with just that. They also wanted to change the politics in the country. After her ouster, a junta ruled the country for 7 years. And while that is a short time in the history of the world, it is a case study, Argentina, of how fast and how total repression can be. The army took over the TV, the radio, the newspapers. But the junta, being that it was right-wing, extremist, militarist, had a problem. Argentina was then, as it is today, a country of diverse politics, where people were used to speaking and going out on the street in demonstrations. A country of brilliant writers, fairly leftist politics, where leftists weren't excluded from the government, but usually part of it. Strong, powerful trade unions, and vibrant discussions of politics in cafes across the cities and towns. How do you dislodge all this? The junta's reaction was to literally kill its enemies. But unlike dictatorships in the past, they decided they would do it in a quiet way. Union leaders who tried to organize, students who tried to protest, members of the political parties, quite literally disappeared. Scores, then hundreds. By the second year of the junta, thousands, men, women, were taken to the Naval College, or one of 340 centers. They were tortured to get more names to capture and killed. Buried in secret graves, we know that some of them were drugged and dropped out of planes into the ocean. The junta, when they felt like explaining, blamed it on the guerrilla war that they were waging, blamed it on a conflict they were having with Chile. But the disappeareds were more than just people who had anything to do with the guerrilla movement or with the war with Chile, and everyone knew it. And those families who saw their loved ones being taken from their house at night and expected maybe after a little questioning they'd be back and never saw them again, they knew it too. The murderous junta, like any government, ran into problems. They didn't have to worry about the vote, but they did have to worry about public opinion and foreign opinion to an extent. They ran into severe economic problems, high unemployment, 13%, running up debt, having trouble attracting foreign investment. Then they started to fight among themselves. There were some moderates who wished to restore unions in order to improve wages for people, maybe get a boost for the economy. The junta initially had instituted an extreme free market system. So they were fighting amongst themselves. The moderate general prevails. In 1980, the guerrilla war ends. Unions restored, not to its full self. But they had another issue. A group began to violate the ban on protest and stand next to the Casa Rosada, the very presidential palace in Buenos Aires. They were the mothers of the victims of the junta, and they wore white scarves. The police weren't quite sure what to do with them. First in 1977, there were 14 of them. The next year there were hundreds, covered by the Argentine press and enjoying tremendous popular support in the nation. They held signs with photos of their children and wore their names. The government responded with ridicule. They called them the Las Locas, the mad women. In 1978, when Argentina hosted the World Cup, the soccer championship, the junta in Argentina had rounded up many of its enemies who couldn't cause trouble. But the mothers were there. And international press started to follow their case. Despite the tremendous popular backing they had and the just purpose that they had, the junta did go after this new threat. These mothers of the disappeared received visits from police at their home, threatening phone calls. Sometimes they were beaten by government thugs. A few times they were arrested in the square, taken in a van, and spent the night in jail. 3 of the mothers were themselves disappeared. But the mothers didn't stop. And at the same time, another secret movement began in churches throughout the country, headed up by a sculptor and university professor, Adolfo Esquivel, the Peace and Justice Service. They handed out flyers in buses, in public squares, wherever they could get away with it. And they had secret meetings in churches where people could get organized and get education about what the junta was doing and how to resist it. Nothing's got worse. Unemployment, inflation, foreign debt escalated. By 1981, the country was on its 3rd junta dictator, and small protests murmured. A union, for instance, held a peace and bread demonstration, not criticizing the junta government, not looking for its overthrow, but just looking for peace and bread and work. Still, it was a sign that something was wrong in the country. The Argentine Catholic bishops, in 1981, issued a letter criticizing the methods of the regime. So there were cracks forming. The end would come in 1982. To counter a poor economy and a threatened series of strikes coming, the president, the 3rd dictator, Galtieri, invaded 2 British islands, maybe of 1,800 people, 49 British soldiers. Didn't meet much resistance, and as the President Galtieri said at the time, I judged any retaliation from the English scarcely possible. They took the 49 British soldiers on the island, flew them to Uruguay. No harm, no foul, right? Judged wrong. British fleet would surround the island, blocking any reinforcements. After some naval battles, a British ship was sunk. Sailors died. Argentine ship was sunk. Sailors died. UN-US tried to negotiate. Not successful. The Argentines are playing a hard line, looking for some kind of statement that would make their government look good and win popular support. The Falkland Islands War, very popular in Argentina. The British don't back down. Eventually they storm the island and secure the capital. Galtieri's government is crushed. Now you have protests of 20,000, 100,000 filling the streets in Buenos Aires. No one's fearing the government anymore. By December 1983, Raul Alfonsin, a lawyer who had helped some of the families of the disappeared, is elected president. Another point in the context of answering the question of how many people do you need to start a revolution, to make a policy change in America, is the idea that the American Revolution was supported just by a small group of people, just by a third of American colonists. And there is a saying that goes that a third supported the revolution, a third were opposed, and a third were in between. A good rule of thumb, at least for understanding the situation in America, because the continent was divided. It wasn't just the Minutemen taking on the Redcoats everywhere across the nation. There was divisions, and some people were still supporting the crown. I think the important thing is that this fact has been used by commentators to describe how even if an issue of the modern era has a small support, say 33%, it could be overcome because look at the American Revolution. That only had 33% support, and we're a free nation. Not surprisingly, it's therefore used by both right and left in political discussions. Let's look at it. I think first you need to look at the actual quote and where it originates from. Not that that's the end of the story. It is taken from a letter of John Adams in 1813. Except John Adams is referring to the French Revolution. He says 1/3 supported England, 1/3 supported France, 1/3 in between. And that letter was misapplied by a historian in 1900. And so we are where we are. And for many people, that's case closed. Okay, so the fact is wrong. But I think that's just the historiography of it. It's a much more complex question, and there are some elements where it is kind of right in a sense. Adams has another quote to Thomas McKean in a letter, fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence. He said, "If we allow 2/3 of the people had been with us in the Revolution, is not the allowance ample?" So now John Adams, in that quote, is actually saying that 2/3 were with the Revolution. And it sounds more right. But how do we even know? Well, we have a few hard numbers, but not many. Something interesting about the American Army during the Revolutionary War is that it functions kind of as a giant, constant public opinion poll because soldiers would join the Army, soldiers would leave the Army. The Continental Congress initially wanted a force of about 35,000. They never got at any one time more than 25,000 under Washington's command and usually split up. Washington's army, the northern commander, and the southern commander. A lot of bickering, all armies ill-supplied. Sometimes there were mutinies, particularly in the later parts of the war, that had to be put down. But overall, about 100,000 men, is estimated, served in the Continental Army over the course of the war. They served at different times. It rotated. This was supplemented by colonial militias, who in many cases would stay in their home area, their home state, or even their home county. But if there was a British force coming through, if Washington's army was where they were located, they may join the fight. And so militia units joined in the Yorktown effort, in the battles of Saratoga, Cowpens, Kings Mountain. But these units weren't necessarily donating their services to follow around Washington and his army or the northern or southern commanders. Really loose estimates. It's from payroll records, from letters of various generals, Washington's aides, and letters to the Continental Congress. And estimates are anywhere. There was a fighting force of 230,000, if you're counting all the militias and the Continental Army. But at any one time, no more than 90,000, and that 90,000 was scattered throughout the country and not presentable to one foe at all. And probably not all willing to fight at the same time. There was a force of about 25,000 that would fight at any given time, and sometimes it was much less, particularly towards the end of the war. This is all in the context of a population of about 2.5 million in the American colonies at the time of the Revolution. But there were just about 20 to 30,000 who served in loyalist militias, who actually fought with the Redcoats. Another way to measure this is how many people left the nation after they didn't get what they wanted, right? The British didn't win. So at the end of the war, about 80 to 100,000 went to England or Halifax or somewhere within the British Empire after the war. That's a small number compared to the population. Small number of those who fled or fought. But the problem is, many loyalists probably kept their ideas in their heads, didn't leave, and not all fought in the militia, certainly. So there was an invisible population, sometimes visible and vocal population of loyalists who stayed. Historians estimate it's anywhere from 10, on the low side, to 25%, but much less in most estimates than a third. But here's where I think we can look at some things that get more relevant to the question at hand. Support for the revolution in any case was geographically based. It depended on where you were to a great extent, and also who you were, but where you were. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island were rabid for the independence movement. A British army from Halifax had occupied Boston in 1768. Most of the coercive acts were applying to Boston. They were tired of it already. In fact, when the British fled Boston, only about 900 people fled with them. Strong support for the independence movement in New England. And if you went to the places where New Englanders settled, and Kevin Phillips in his book Cousins' Wars does a great job of this, they took their values with them. And you got support for the war in these areas. Eastern Long Island is one, originally colonized by New Englanders. Newark, New Jersey, Cape May, New Jersey. These were towns settled by New Englanders and areas of high support for the independence, not just the third. German areas near Philadelphia were not places where there'd be debate over independence. They were mustering grounds for colonial militias. And then there's those Ulster Irish. No third there. Belfast, Antrim, Pennsylvania. Their ancestors had fought the British, and they were eager to do so again. Coastal ports of the South, where they depended on trade that the British were restricting, they weren't soft in the support for the revolution either. And likewise, Virginia tobacco fields were blazing timber for the revolution, though some parts of Virginia, like say the town of Norfolk, where it was the center of Scottish merchants who were pretty much loyal to the king. Scots as well in upper New York. They'd earned land grants from fighting in the French and Indian War for George III. They weren't about to fight against him. The same with the Highlanders who lived in the south of North Carolina. Southern New Jersey, Delaware, New York City were bastions of loyalist feeling. Backcountry South Carolina wanted little part in a war for independence. Philadelphia, with its Quakers, no longer a majority there, but powerful, also opposed. Now they get a bad rap because there were hundreds of Quakers who actually fought, usually got kicked out of their friends groups. So, the one-third is blurry because it does depend where you are, and it's not just simply measuring a big public opinion pool like we do today. But it gives you an idea. The Loyalists might be a small part of New York or Philadelphia, for instance, but they were a big part of the power structures there, in a country where democracy wasn't quite there yet. Not everybody got a vote. The influence for some people was much greater than their numbers, right? So we're not just doing a poll and saying how many mechanics and artisans are for independence. That may not be relevant to really understanding the situation on the ground in 1775. Another point to make here is that the way that people want to use this rule of thumb about the revolution, which is to say, like, hey, if your issue only has 33%, it can grow. Look at the American Revolution, is probably not true then, because there was far more support on the continents for independence than not. If anything, John Adams could be right, or anywhere from half to John Adams' 2/3 were supporting the independence war, a small percentage, maybe 10 or 15% against, and the rest in between, maybe switching around as the armies moved through their villages. So that makes the revolution ill-suited as an example of a small matter that built into a movement and then changed public policy. The issues behind the revolution: restriction on trading with the Caribbean and foreign nations, restrictions on westward expansion, were angering Americans in the continent, and that was a pretty broad sentiment, in addition to the taxes and the presence of troops and the onslaught of Hessians and everything else. It's probably possible to look more at, say, the period before the Stamp Act protests, and then say, how did that movement build? But the revolution's quite a different situation. I don't think there's a uniform answer to the question of what percentage of people do you need to get your issue addressed, to get policy change. Often change happens at just the very elite levels, mixed perhaps with some popular movement. I look at the fall of the USSR, for instance. In 1989, protesters who tried to raise the tricolor flag in Red Square were beaten down by militia units. 3 years later, that was the official flag of the government. And while that was a general popular movement, or had elements of it, the Russian White House and the defense of that with Boris Yeltsin standing in the tank and the crowds that helped out with that, there was a lot of insider stuff going on in the fall of the USSR. You starting with the top-down perestroika. That wasn't a movement from the bottom. That was ordered from the top to try to clear the corruption. Perhaps it didn't always go the way that the top folks in the Politburo wanted, that Gorbachev wanted. Same thing with the elections. That was addressed top down. We're going to have elections. They hoped that candidates would be elected that were of a different nature that ended up being elected, but it was a top-down change. Russian nationalism and the development of a Russian bureaucracy where people that were aligned with Yeltsin just said, you know what, thank you very much. We're going to take the power away from the Union and give it to the Russian Republic. So while there's a lot of popular change going on, there's also a lot of elite insider politics change and elites battling with each other. I suppose I'm building to an answer to say you just can't answer this by saying, hey, once you get 1/3 of the people, you win your issue. It's more about the quality of support. Have to be dedicated. The issue has to be righteous, the cause valid, so that it's compelling. And you have to be aware that a lot of people are going to get involved in your movement that don't have the same intensity as the core volunteers, so there has to be avenues for participation that vary to the intensity of the potential voter or activist. Okay, well, Bruce, you've done it again. You've given me all this history, but how do we relate it to anything that we're talking about, the politics of today? Quick summary. If you ask me, what is a recipe for political change? It's a couple of things. Really dedicated volunteers, really good cause that is broadly compelling, a disciplined organization with patience, help from powers exterior to the conflict, often infighting among the opponents, among the elites. Something I think is truly important is that a successful movement has several avenues for participation based on the intensity of the activist, the voter, the person that you want to participate. Successful movements learn to have ways that people can express their support even if they're not the most intense activists. And that's important. Maybe they can be converted later. There's only going to be so many people who will go out and protest in a march. There's only so many people who will write a letter to a congressman these days, but these are the old-fashioned forms of political protest, right? In the 21st century, I think where most of this happens now is on the internet. It doesn't sound very powerful, right? There's a major issue, there's a violation of my constitutional rights, and I sent an email. I posted on a blog. If it's the avenue where regular political conversation occurs, it's going to be the avenue where political protest occurs as well, because it's the same forums and websites and blogs where one might post a complaint is the same thing that the president, that members of Congress will need to go to talk to voters. In the 1960s, it might have been about sitting in a government building, and that option's still available for those that want to do that. A more realistic form of protest, and one that could be, I believe, very effective, is simply using the internet until the discussion on the internet is impossible to ignore. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. We'd love to hear from you on Twitter at myhist, at MYHIST for Twitter. And if you like the program, please tell someone about it. That's the way the word spreads. And I do thank you for listening.
Hi, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat, emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month, even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending, zero tears.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.